I'm most grateful to my host for recalling me from my plough in rural Northumberland to talk to you about myths of origin in the United Kingdom and the United States. Although, having mentioned these two states, we are not confined to them, and we must acknowledge that myths of origin are still immensely influential, as they are in Putin's rationale, his 5,000-word essay that he produced to explain Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. Myths of origins have direct practical consequences. With the greatest respect to my learned colleagues here, they are not just for the entertainment of Cambridge classicists, worthy though they be in their role. Myths of origin, though, are not confined to dictatorships. Today, I'll pose some general questions and then ask how we find these issues in operation in the histories of the United Kingdom and the United States. First, what are myths of origin? Why do people devise them? How do they work? And then turning to these two states, I shall then ask, when and how did their national myths arise? Did those myths experience trajectories over time? Were they subjected to revision as a result of historical research or of events? And finally, if myths of origin are such dangerous things, how should they be dealt with? What are myths of origin, then? Let's start from where we are. At the end of the last ice age in the Northern Hemisphere, the glaciers retreated and the snowfields melted. They were replaced by forests and meadows. At that point, tiny bands of people moved in and began to practice arable and livestock farming. They were the last innocent generation. But their farming practices created the idea of private property and land, which cannot have existed among hunter-gatherers. And so subsequent mass migrations had to entail forcible dispossession. Therefore, since that time, all polities of which we have written record began in the same way, with enormous episodes of murder and theft. And such realities had to be turned into episodes that were ethically justified, indeed often divinely sanctioned. Stable, peaceful societies had to be derived from unstable and violent origins. The evolution over only a few thousand years of the complex societies of today was never inevitable. In their evolution, myths of origin played an important part by promoting good practices, but also by continuing to camouflage bad ones. So if polities typically arise in violent episodes, we can appreciate that they do not have founding principles unless we apply that label to murder and theft. These episodes aren't ones revealing the working out of general principles of government or of universal human rights. Instead, they are episodes of chaos. Out of the chaos, step forward individuals claiming to interpret those episodes to explain what they mean. Those meanings are at the outset heavily disputed. Over time, certain interpretations often emerge as hegemonic, but they are never uncontested and never immortal. They change over time. And if so, stable values and practices can never be inferred from claimed founding principles. These founding principles have to be expressed in terms too general to be meaningful, like the written constitutions to which they sometimes give rise. The US and the UK are claimed to be democracies, but their political systems work in different ways. They are held to pursue liberty, but liberty to do what? A myth of origin is unlikely to be decisive. To be effective, it's got to contain elements of truth and elements of falsehood. To make the falsehood palatable is the purpose of the myth. To make them plausible, myths of origin are expressed as histories. So they can be better examined through the discipline of history than through the discipline of philosophy. Secondly, then, what do the histories of the UK and the USA show? Here is a paradox. Historians outside the US have failed to resolve. The riddle is the nature and causes of the American Revolution. The War of 1776-83 was quite unlike wars of national liberation. It was not a war between Catholics and Protestant, or between capitalist and socialist. It was not between a militarist and a pacifist society. It was not a conflict between people of different skin colours. On the contrary, the two cultures were similar. The myth of origins of the new United States then does not explain the American Revolution. My own professional contribution, here's my hobby horse, was to suggest that one aspect of the American Revolution was that it contained some elements of a war of religion. And that explains part of the myth of origins that won acceptance in the New Republic. The revolution had to be misrepresented if it was to be sanitized. The revolution was not preceded by reflections in the American colonies on the nature and merits of republican government. The reality of the revolution was not republicanism or universal human rights. Instead, these made up the subsequent myth of origins, the reality and major elements of sectarian conflict. And the outcome was a polity that the Protestant dissenters made. It glorified a nation of religious destiny, in biblical imagery, a city on a hill. What about the UK? In recent centuries, one influential myth of origin derived from the Revolution of 1688. Its reality was that it was an armed rebellion backed by a foreign invasion intended to destroy a Catholic monarchy and replace it with a Protestant one to ensure liberty. This entered into the myth of origins created after 1688. It claimed that England was essentially dedicated to liberty. This myth of origins was resisted by peoples that the English conquered and in countries thereafter held by force. The interpretation of the Revolution of 1688 was lastly contested, even in England, by Tories and Jacobites, also by Scots and Irish on the periphery, but these challenges were beaten off by force. Britain fought the American War with an entrenched belief that it was consistent with a free constitution for the Westminster Parliament to legislate for the colonies, a principle that survived defeat. The American Revolution did not have decisive consequences in England. At home, the regime was challenged by a series of revolutionaries, as in the early years of the French Revolution, people who appealed back to the 1640s. After 1815, by radicals, revolutionaries who invoked the idea of an Anglo-Saxon free constitution. English socialists planned the achievement of a socialist society by invoking an idea of the prosperity of workers in the late Middle Ages before the rise of capitalism. Myths of origin. None of these threatened revolutions happened, and instead English history has been reinterpreted by historians, not by revolutionaries. The new historical myth is that England, now Britain, is built on the values of pluralism and diversity, a myth claiming to be based on the notion that universal human rights were a creation of that other and even more splendid historical myth called the Enlightenment. So what happened in the new United States? Since its myth of origin was premised on a justified revolution, the idea that a second revolution was necessary to bring about a just society, for example, a socialist revolution, had no space in which to develop. The hegemonic myth of origins of the United States was therefore long-lasting. Victory for the southern states in the Civil War of 1861-5 would have destroyed it. The victory of the northern states confirmed it. It emerged greatly strengthened from the military victory of 1945. But myths of origin are mostly modified or discarded because of military defeat. In the United States, too, the major modifier was military defeat, although a minor military defeat, in the Vietnam War. The myth of origins was significantly changed then, not by historicizing it, subjecting it to historical analysis, but by changing its owners, by including others within it, notably women and African Americans, but not until very, very recently, Native Americans. In that new form, it's still powerful. The myth of the career open to talents is still hegemonic in the United States, although the statistics of social mobility in the US are a little different from social mobility in other similarly advanced societies. It's true the myth has been secularized. John Gast's famous picture, American Progress, was painted in 1872. It showed parties of white settlers moving westwards across the continent with Native Americans fleeing before them. But it was urged on, not by God, but by the figure of an airborne female representing Columbia, a personification of America itself. Thanks to the myth of origins, the land empire of the United States is not allowed to stand as an instance of imperialism. The US is described as an exception. In 1998, a conference organized at Rome by the United Nations considered a document establishing an international criminal court. The United States voted against, and in 2002, a US federal act asserted the independence of the United States from the jurisdiction of that court. US power is no longer projected with a missionary impulse, as it was by Woodrow Wilson. It is about democracy exported around the world, but it has profound similarities. How then, finally, should we deal with myths of origin? As an historian, I suggest that we analyze them historically. We must focus on their two parts. First, myths, then origins. First, myths. These are partial untruths, deliberate untruths, used to claim authority. Something, partly a fiction, happened in the past, therefore it should happen in reality in the future. Traditions are different. They are practices, acted out voluntarily by individuals. Myths are ideologies imposed on individuals by ideologists. But the choice of what version of the past to which authority is given must inevitably be arbitrary. Germans might prefer the Germany of Goethe and Schiller to the Germany of Hitler and Goebbels, but why not prefer the Germany of Luther to that of Goethe and Schiller? Secondly, origins. What people choose to call the origin of their state is equally an arbitrary choice. The United States looks back to 1776 as its founding, but each individual colony was much older. The founders of each colony, had they survived, might have disagreed profoundly with the Revolution of 1776. Each colony had been constituted by killing or ejecting the earlier occupants. Their myth of origin were deleted. So history is an infinite regress. There is no it, no history with a capital H, to justify any present-day decisions. Traditions, that is, unthinking practices, may be safe guides. Myths of origin may be deeply dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any country in the world which has a more sort of a true myth of origin?
It must be Sweden.
Well, no, we're just celebrating 500 years of independence, and it's based on a lot of great myths that we still believe in.
Then I scratch my head.
Yeah. Is exceptionalism the basis of these myths, that you're a chosen people, you have a special mission in the world, you have a right to be different from other countries?
Yes, I'm sure that's got a lot to do with it, but then the exceptionalism to which states appeal is often very, very similar. What's that line about marriages? Yeah. You know, they're all unhappy in the same way. Or you know the good one-liner, but I don't have it at the moment. I wish you all happy marriages without myths.
Mm. But what happens when the myths sort of break down and they're not gathering the people around one single good idea?
There is not one single good idea. There are many separate good ideas which should each be explored on their merits. Mm. It's when some people stand forward to say that all these good ideas that you actually believe in as individuals, I know they're all different, but actually they are all constituent parts of this one ideal, which mean that you now have to do what I tell you to do, then we are in deep trouble. Mm. And countries, and we're looking at Putin's Russia right now, the fascinating thing to me is why so many Russians obey.